I am very excited to begin this episode with an announcement. I would like to ask those who are listening to help me to commemorate my beloved mother's birthday, which falls on July 30th, and for which I am planning a short online reading from Bharati's English writings. I have previously mentioned my mother many times in the course of this podcast because, quite simply, there can be no study of C. Subramania Bharati without the mention of Dr. S. Vijaya Bharati as well. Vijaya Bharati was not only the granddaughter of the poet, but she was a pioneering Tamil scholar whose doctorate on Bharati's works, completed at Annamalai University in 1966, inaugurated the field of literary criticism of Bharati's poetry. She was a brilliant scholar and completely immersed in Bharati's work. The reading is to be held online on Saturday, August 6th at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Time, live streamed on YouTube, and I'm very grateful to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts and the Writers' Union of Canada, which is what makes this event possible. The reading is part of their National Public Readings program, which they are allowing to take place in a virtual setting as well because of the pandemic situation. Please do attend if you can, as, among other things, your attendance will encourage further support from Canada's arts organizations for work on Bharati. There will also be a live Q&A session with me after the reading, when you can feel free to ask questions about anything that interests you regarding Bharati, his work, or of course, his family. My mother was a unique individual. She was truly Bharati's granddaughter. And for me, I consider her both my mother and, particularly where Bharati studies are concerned, my Guru. Guru Sakshat Parabrahma. Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and legacy of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, 100 years after his death. This is Meera T. Sundararajan, the poet's great-granddaughter. Some weeks ago, in a historic first, the International Booker Prize, a prestigious literary award given to writers writing in a language other than English, was given for the first time to a writer writing in any Indian language. The writer's name is Gitanjali Shree, and her translator into English is Daisy Rockwell. As a lover of modern literature, I think it would be difficult to overstate the importance of what has been achieved by Gitanjali Shree and her translator. It is a strange and disturbing paradox that Indian literature of the 20th century, and of course before, is more or less absent from the history of modern world literature. This is not to say that Indian writers are not known in the West and internationally. They are, but as writers writing in English, authors in the genre of post-colonial literature, authors who write from former British colonies and are now using the English language as their primary or only language of expression. Indeed, the genre of post-colonial literature would be extremely impoverished without these writers from India and South Asia, who have played such a crucial role in developing a sense of literary reckoning with the colonial experience and its aftermath, which, as has often been emphasized in the course of this podcast, is an aftermath that is ongoing. Over at least the past couple of decades, the contributions of South Asian writers to the English language itself have also grown to be considered significant, with many Indian writers receiving acclaim for their stylistic and aesthetic approaches to writing in English. The relationship between English and Indian languages is actually very complex. Given the background of colonial domination, some Indians have historically seen English primarily as the language of the colonizer and rejected it on those grounds. But I would argue that this has not been the primary attitude of Indian writers towards English. In the case of Bharati, now universally acknowledged as the greatest Tamil writer of the 20th century, it can be said unambiguously and most emphatically that he did not view English primarily as the language of the colonizer. On the contrary, he saw English as a great and noble literary language, and he quite simply fell in love with English poetry. He went so far as to adopt for his pen name the name of Shelley Dasan, servant of Shelley, after the English Romantic poet whose verses he so admired, and whose passionate, revolutionary, and linguistically virtuosic poetry reflected a kindred spirit to Bharati himself. It is also worth noting that in paying this particular form of homage, Bharati followed in a long tradition of poets, adopting the names of their heroes and proclaiming themselves servants of their poetical or indeed spiritual models. Kalidasa, known thus as the servant of Hindu goddess Kali, and author of famed epics in the Sanskrit language, including Shakuntala, was perhaps the most illustrious of these. Indeed, Bharati himself so admired Kalidasa that he named his second daughter after the heroine of Kalidasa's epic, which Bharati read and studied in the original Sanskrit, Shakuntala. And Bharati himself eventually came to be so honored by poet Bharati Dasan, his follower, who thus called himself Bharati's servant. My mother, Bharati's granddaughter, scholar S. Vijaya Bharati, whose birthday falls this weekend on July 30th, used to sing one of Bharati Dasan's songs so wonderfully that the poet himself, upon hearing her, spontaneously asked her to sing it at an assembly where he was presiding. Sadly, my mother never recorded this song, at least not to my knowledge, for there may be a recording somewhere in the archives of All India Radio where she sang frequently in her youth that is waiting now to be discovered. But my mother often spoke of the devoted friendship of Bharati Dasan for her and for our family, and of his profound devotion to Bharati, his poetical mentor, and, as Indians say, his guru. But Bharati's passion for languages should not be confused with any kind of flagging enthusiasm for his own mother tongue, Tamil. All Tamils know of Bharati's legendary love for the Tamil language. And even if they cannot quote much else from Bharati's poetry, they will quote the now ubiquitous lines from Bharati's Tamil poem, where he says that Tamil is the sweetest language known to him. And it is crucial to understand how proud Bharati was. As a Tamil, he was extremely proud of the rich literary heritage of the Tamil language, which, he argued, was one of the world's great languages and should be treated, at the very least, on a par with the European tongues of England, France, and Germany. His claims about the status of Tamil were based not primarily on his passion for the language, but instead on his deep knowledge of Tamil and his rich knowledge of Indian and world languages as well. All of this led him to well-informed conclusions about the relative stature of Tamil, well-researched conclusions. Moreover, Bharati goes a step further, and he suggests that a study of Tamil literary history reveals unique linguistic and literary treasures, which do not have parallels in modern European languages. As such, Tamil should properly be recognized as a variety of literary and indeed classical language. As always, Bharati's arguments about the Tamil language and literature were based on facts. The reason he had to make those arguments was because the English were engaged in a systematic process of trying to establish linguistic dominance over the subcontinent, discouraging the use of Indian languages, including Tamil, and favoring English in their place in important contexts such as education. In many ways, that conquest is almost complete today, since most education in India includes an important English component. In many places, English is the primary language of education in India. India is not unique by any means in this primacy of English, in this importance given to English education. However, the colonial experience has arguably affected both the trajectory of Indian languages as well as Indians' own perceptions of their mother tongues. For example, my mother, who became a Tamil scholar at the level of her master's degree after beginning her university studies in mathematics and science, has often spoken of the lack of prestige accorded to Tamil in her time. From Bharati's perspective, such an attitude would have been simply unthinkable, sacrilegious, and utterly ignorant. The Tamil language was the treasure of Tamil culture, was and is, and he absolutely insisted that this be recognized by all, Tamilians and non-Tamil speakers alike. But again, Bharati was both a Tamilian and a lover of languages. And his love of language was based on deep scholarship, out of which must have grown an awareness of the interrelationships, the familial links between languages. How would it be possible for him to hate English, a language that traced its own ancestry to Sanskrit? The Sanskrit language was studied by Bharati. He considered it a wellspring of Indian culture, and he would have been profoundly, practically aware of the interrelationships between Sanskrit and Tamil, as I understand that both words and structures have been shown to move systematically over time between these two languages. And Tamil, of course, is the oldest surviving of the Dravidian language group in South India, which includes the tremendously distinguished literary languages of Telugu, with its preeminent role in Indian classical music, leading it to be known as the Italian of the East, as well as Kannada and Malayalam, spoken in Karnataka and Kerala, respectively. And yet, in spite of the wealth of literary traditions apparent in Indian languages, the question of modern writing in India during the 20th century is almost a kind of black hole, in something quite akin to the astronomical sense of the term. I think it's a very useful metaphor in this context, because where are India's writers in Indian languages over the past 100 years? Where are the translations into English of their works? Who among those Indian writers occupies a significant place in world literature of the 20th century? Who among them is known as a modernist writer in the sense of, say, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and so many others writing in the English language? And then, of course, there are the modernists, the important 20th century and late 19th century writers writing in various European languages and in Russian. Where are the Indian writers? Can it really be that in a country with a literary history comfortably going back 2 millennia and more, whose soil has allowed the giant sequoias of at least 2 classical languages to flourish, Sanskrit and Tamil, one of which continues to be actively in use today? How is it possible that there are practically no modern writers of note hailing from this territory. In fact, there is one, and only one such writer who occupies some place on the world stage, and that is Rabindranath Tagore, pioneer of Bengali literature, who became the one and only Indian writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature to date, back in 1913. This issue has been discussed in a previous episode of this podcast. Because, of course, there was more than one important Indian writer in the 20th century. This podcast is dedicated to another such writer, C. Subramania Bharati. So, how many others are there? And I think after years of being curious, puzzled, and perplexed as to why Indian literature generally appears not to have been represented in histories of modernist or 20th century literature, the answer has finally become clear to me now. Indian literature is not present on the world stage because of the active role taken by the British imperial government in promoting English in India at the expense of Indian languages, and indeed, in its active suppression of writers like Bharati, who were dedicated to the cause of Indian freedom. In his essay on free speech, to which I intend to return in more depth in a later episode of this podcast, Bharati writes about this. He says, "All right-minded English people will agree with me that only those Indians who live and strive for Indian autonomy are the true sons of the motherland, not those others who deify titles and higher salaries. And the thoughts that true patriots are thinking today will materialize into national facts tomorrow. Those who desire to cultivate friendly relations with India must learn to respect and, if possible, satisfy immediately the legitimate and reasoned demands of Indian seers and creators. I believe it is therefore our role today, and for me personally, as someone hailing from a Tamil literary family, this is an issue that has the deepest personal resonance. We must play a part in correcting this situation and in introducing Indian writers of the last century to a new readership, allowing them to play, at last, the parts that they wished to play in establishing a new world order where linguistic and cultural diversity would be present and, as Bharati fervently hoped, prized. Given the dominance of English today, I believe that reinstating these writers to their rightful place in history and on the world stage can also play a crucial role in awakening interest around the world in India's valuable literary and linguistic heritage. India is a place of extraordinary richness, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, artistic, cultural, musical, and philosophical. And India's writers and thinkers simultaneously represent ancient culture and modern vision. They have a boldness and originality that someone unfamiliar with these traditions can, I think, hardly imagine. They have extremely valuable contributions to make to the world today. By her passion for writing in Hindi and her marvelous achievement in her novel Tomb of Sand, her Hindi language novel, which won the International Booker Prize for the first time for a work written in an Indian language, Gitanjali Shree and her translator, Daisy Rockwell, have made a landmark contribution to this process of reckoning and renewal. In my next episode, I hope to talk about Bharati's attitude specifically towards translation from Tamil into English, and I plan to read some excerpts from his peerless translations of classical Tamil poems, which appear among his other collected writings in English in the coming age. Prepare for your heart to melt.